Texas newspaper reporter. It had been a busy time at the offices of the Houston Chronicle. The young reporter had graduated with her degree in journalism from Texas A&M, the exact year that the first referendum for independence had been given and vastly approved by voters. The newspapers across the state scrambled for additional reporters to cover the historic events that would occur, and she had been riding the crest of the wave ever since. She had been present in Austin when the convention first met to decide on the details which would lead to independence. On the morning of the first session, the people of Austin were shocked to see at first light tanks with Texas flags and military roadblocks in place, effectively locking out the rest of the world from the city center, isolating the convention, gathered world press, and invited world speakers and delegates. She had the press pass and freely passed through checkpoints. Whenever she saw the giant angular tanks with the flags of the new republic proudly flying from their turrets, she almost cried with pride. She was witnessing history, and she knew it. She and everyone she knew had become deeply religious since the start of the independence movement. The convention had been exciting. There were many invited speakers, and each one had to be interviewed. Speakers came from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, of course, but also France. France had sent a whole delegation, as had Mexico. The Philippines and Chile, two countries with historic people power movements that guided their proud nations to independence peacefully against hostile military pressure, also sent representatives who proudly encouraged the delegates to continue their efforts without fear, the two nations echoed, as if reading from the same script. The United States, of course, sent representatives, but these had been intercepted by the Texas Rangers and detained until they'd agreed to leave the city without protest. These representatives often had histories involving the U.S. State Department, CIA, or otherwise suspicious links. Members of Congress from Washington, D.C., as well as a Supreme Court justice, had been seated and allowed to address the convention, but they arrived individually without official credentials from the U.S. federal government. Lately, however, she'd been given a remarkable opportunity to interview the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama had made an official visit to the new republic and addressed the convention. The new Congress had been elected, but was not sworn in and seated yet, so the convention still addressed the day-to-day challenges and needs of the new republic. He would stay to see the new Congress meet for the first time. He would address the new Congress as well, although perhaps not the first day. He had an interesting angle, putting things in a new historical light. The Chronicle ran his story on the front page. The plight of Tibet had gained worldwide attention for a couple of generations now, yet the Dalai Lama, perhaps one of the keenest minds alive, had seen a parallel he wished to share. Tibet had been invaded by China and thereafter incorporated into China through force. Texas, similarly, had been occupied by an invading army, the Union Army, in 1865, and forced through coercion to rejoin the United States. This clearly was not the free will of the people, under the point of a bayonet, yet freedom cannot be contained. Though it took generations to work itself free of the fetters, Texas once again joined the company of free nations. The whole Texas independence movement had inspired the aging leader to hope that one day, perhaps not far off, his own Tibet would once again be a free nation. He joked with the audience that he hoped Tibet would not take as long as Texas had taken. His charm was contagious, so contagious that many people found themselves smiling a deeply satisfied smile for hours after he'd left. There was many a conversation on the nature of holiness after the Dalai Lama had left Austin. But now her attention was far from Austin. She was back in Houston, seeing yet another historical event. The Texas budget had swelled to an enormous size. The accountants in the government recommended, for the sake of simplicity, that the income tax of individuals be simply adopted from the previous year's U.S. income tax guidelines. In effect, Texas would start its national taxes from absorbed U.S. taxes that otherwise would have gone to Washington and the dreaded IRS. Yet when this tax income was coupled with the corporate taxes, also left unchanged from the previous year's U.S. tax guidelines, the lawmakers were aghast and amazed. There was a huge budget surplus. People openly asked how in the world the U.S. government had spent such enormous sums of money. Money was allocated for the construction of a passenger railway connecting the triangle of Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. A modern seaport was to be constructed at the port of Brownsville. Clinics were proposed. Funding was there for them to be built in as many locations around the state, rumored to be 50, where citizens could receive free basic medical care. Later, thought was given and funded allocated to expand these clinics to include a drug treatment center as part of each clinic. Anyone free of charge could receive treatment for drug addiction as well as alcohol and tobacco addiction. Some genius in Austin decided to propose a foreign legion of healthcare professionals. Foreign doctors and other healthcare providers could apply and receive positions at these free clinics and treatment centers, and after 5 years of service be given citizenship and released from their obligations at the center. This Foreign Medical Legion was later renamed the Texas Foreign Professional Corps, and would include engineers, especially after the oil and gas industry was nationalized. Yet even after all this expenditure, extra money remained. The Texas government looked at the aging battleship Texas, long out of the water and a stationary monument. Serious inquiry was also made in the status of the aircraft carrier Lexington. Could these old museum ships be repaired and refloated? The money seemed to be there. The nation could refloat these two aging relics. The government of France was offering to help rearm the ships and get the Texas Navy off on the right foot. They would be fitted with modern armament, instrumentation, and new nuclear engines. It might take 2 years to get the ships ready and the engines working, but rumor had it that Texas A&M was preparing a proposal to repair the battleship Texas to allow it to sail under her own steam to France. She was nearly rusted through, though, and the challenge was going to be huge. Supposedly the aircraft carrier Lexington was in better shape, but a team of engineers from Texas Tech was to survey the old wreck, as some referred to her, to see what it would take to sail her also to France, to receive not only new instrumentation and engines, but French aircraft. There was a lot of talk flying around about these ships. Texas A&M Cadet Corps had volunteered to sail the battleship to her destination. The battleship Texas could perhaps be escorted by the submarine the City of Corpus Christi, and the Lexington escorted by the submarine Dallas, both submarines being, in effect, the entire Texas Navy at the present. Both had been purchased from the United States intact, with nuclear warheads removed, although rumors persisted that the Republic of Texas had nuclear weapons already reinstalled on both ships. Yet this reporter could not get inside them, at least not yet. At any rate, the word was spreading that the new nation was not likely to send out its entire navy. The two subs would probably be sent under the water, guarding the coast for a time. Even with the estimates of refitting both the aging battleship and the Lady Lex, and the cost of their transport were taken into consideration, the federal budget of Texas still had a surplus. What to do with the money? One genius idea which had greatly improved the national budget of Texas was the idea that credit cards should be banned. The old Lone Star card, which had been in use for aid to the poor, was now the only national interest-charging credit card in the Republic. Banks were still independent, of course, but they could issue only debit cards. The people of Texas would not be plunged into debt as their cousins in the U.S. had been a generation earlier by credit card traps. Personal property, according to the Homestead Act, could not be seized in foreclosure proceedings, and interest-charging credit cards would be issued only by the Federal Bank of Texas. If people could not pay their debts, it would be punishable by community service and possibly jail time. But personal property would never be taken away unless felonious crimes had taken place on the property, not for mere debt. The idea proved popular and caused the accountants in Austin some deep contemplation as to where the vast sums of money gleaned from such interest-bearing transactions had gone. In Texas, these monies would be used for the public good. One story the reporter was able to travel to cover involved the first Texas embassies opening in places around the world. She'd covered the old Texas embassy being reopened in London and a new embassy being opened in Manila in the Philippines. When she went to London, she was shocked to see that the old Texas embassy still stood where it had always been, just outside the St. James Palace. There was a plaque marking the old location above of the old original Texas embassy in Paris, outside the old Tuileries Palace. The actual address was 1 Place Vendôme, but the building had long since vanished. But here in London the new embassy opened in the same building where the original had stood. She marveled at this. Many times she thought it strange that everything had been left in place, as if a family left with dinner still on the table, only to return almost 200 years later to find everything undisturbed. How can this be, she often asked herself. It just seemed odd. Was Texas destined to become independent again? She thought back to what the Dalai Lama had said in his speech in Austin back in the early days of the Constitutional Convention. She could not remember his exact words, but it was something along the lines of, "The people of the world are all one race, but we are not all one family. We have different traditions, different songs, different families. We live together equally, but we each have the right to be governed by our own chosen leaders, to keep our own traditions, to sing our own songs, and to keep our own house." He yearned for Tibet, the freedom and independence that Texas was now enjoying. But how was all this possible? She just could not wrap her thoughts around all that had happened in the past several years. It just all seemed so natural. Oh, Lou. Chapter selection from the Second Texas Republic by Joe B. The bars closed in Gainesville at 2 a.m. As usual, Frank lingered. He pretended to be preparing to leave, lingering in the bathroom, and then pretending to have something left at the table. He always had such a good time at this little cantina, and he liked the idea of practicing walking between chairs, in case he was stopped and forced to walk the line. Iadira knew the old codger and laughed as he lingered. "Don't you want to go home, Frank?" He snorted back at her. He was a softy, she knew, but he liked to practice this gruff exterior when in the bar. "I know you better, Frank. You know Lou's waiting for you with that big soft bed." He stopped then and thought of her. Yes, she was waiting, and at that time of night, after a few too many rounds and too many attempts at line dancing, the memory of that soft bed was indeed sounding good. He tried not to look at the back and forth motion of the mop Iadira swayed in his path. He also tried not to walk on the wet parts. He carefully tiptoed close to the bar and left. He moseyed on over to his truck. He started it up and headed to the frontage road, to journey to the north back home. Then he noticed them. The honking horns of the cars. They passed, drew his attention. He heard cheers and shouts from the cars and trucks being passed. He smiled. There would not be any random stops checking for drunk drivers tonight. He lit a cigarette and merged onto 35 North. He definitely had to check this out. He could not get too close, because there must be 50 civilian vehicles shouting out of the windows and honking their horns following them. When the lights of Gainesville faded behind him, he turned off the frontage. He knew a good spot to view the proceedings from a higher elevation, on a bluff overlooking the Red River. He pulled away from the convoy of 11 DPS cars, lights aglow, escorting 7 heavy military trucks and a few flatbed trailers with bulldozers in tow, all marked with the new emblem of the Second Texas Republic. He turned off onto a gravel road and pulled up to a locked gate. He fumbled with his key, unlocking it, and drove on into the pasture, neglecting to close the gate behind him. Lou was at home, watching the Turner Classic Movies, occasionally glancing at the clock, waiting for Frank to come stumbling in. When they were younger, there used to be fights about this, of course. But he was a good man. He didn't have a temper. He was gentle and thoughtful. He'd been good to the children. He'd had his share of disappointments and losses in this short life, and he'd just like to go out to the cantina every now and then. Lou long ago lost the affection for the stale smoke smell it left in her hair. They'd reached a compromise. He went to church whenever she did, and she allowed him 2 nights out a month, whichever nights were his choosing. They'd had other arguments after that, because Frank thought he could carry over unused nights from one month to the next. They finally agreed that 2 nights a month would be the limit. What else was he to do now that they were both retired? He drove her crazy when he sat around the house too much. She was still irked by his occasional tardiness, but she allowed him his part of the compromise without too much complaint. But it was rare for him to come home after 2:30 in the morning. It was almost 3 a.m. now. She felt herself starting to doze off. "That bastard," she said to herself as she succumbed to the weight of her eyelids and leaned back in the couch. She jumped awake at the sound of the slamming truck door and running boots in the gravel of the drive. She glanced at her clock. It was just past 4 a.m. She checked the corner where the shotgun was standing and wondered if it had been left loaded. She could cock it for effect if there was a pounding at the door. She relaxed a little when she heard Frank curse as he dropped his keys. He fumbled with the lock, but then fell back off in steps when she flew the door open. "What in the name of God happened to you tonight, Frank?" she could not help but shout. "Lou, Lou," he helplessly stammered, pointing vaguely behind him over his shoulder. He then lay back and just started laughing up at the stars. Lou honestly thought he had perhaps lost his mind. She wondered for a second what she would do if he blew a gasket and turned into the eccentric old crazy he flirted with from time to time. She then knelt beside him and tried to help him up. He suddenly sat up and gripped her shoulders. "Lou, I don't have time to explain. Get dressed and get into the truck as soon as you can. Go now. Hurry it up, girl." He smiled, and she thought for a moment he was 20 years old again. There was a light in his eyes. "Lou," he affectionately squeezed her shoulder. "Lou, darling, you just have to see this to believe it." She rushed inside, thinking for sure it must be a UFO. There was nothing else she could imagine that would cause this reaction in her bizarre old husband. She rushed back out, and the gravel clattered as the windows as he spun the old truck back to the old gravel road with the gate still open. Frank did not say a word the entire drive. She tried to draw it out of him, but he remained silent, only teasing her with, "Lou, you just gotta see it. You just gotta see it to believe it." When they reached the edge of the bluff, he stopped the car. She could see the blinking red lights washing out over the Red River into Oklahoma. She could see a few police cars on the Oklahoma side, and as she walked closer to the edge, a few uniformed police officers could be seen to mingle in the middle of the Interstate 35 bridge. Traffic was backed up a long way into Oklahoma coming south, but traffic moved at a walking pace in a steady line north. She could hear conversation and laughter. Then when she reached the edge of the bluff and looked down, she gasped. "Oh my," was the only word she could find. She then laughed and was startled at the sound of her voice. She glanced below and then looked into Frank's beaming face. "Oh my," she exclaimed again, and then that strange laugh, which she had not heard since she was a teenager, escaped her lips again. Frank beamed back at her, his eyes bright with the blinking red and blue and white strobes from the vehicles below them. The Texas State Guard had started erecting roadblocks and border checkpoints at the highway bridge. Every time the bulldozer moved, it seemed, fresh cheers from the dozens of onlookers drowned out the roar. The soldiers were walking around now, shouting at each other and gesturing the crowds back. The machinery stopped, and the soldiers, seemingly in one fluid motion, formed a straight line along the roadway edge. One of them shouted something, and they stood at attention. It was then that Frank and Lou noticed what was coming up the road toward the Red River Bridge. There was a huge line of vehicles as far back as they could see. At first, it was what must have been 100 little white and green vehicles. The Border Patrol, Frank laughed. These were followed by civilian-looking vehicles, interspersed with official-looking cars, other types of what must have been federal police cars of various types with emergency lights ablaze, forestry vehicles, federal motor pool vehicles, and then a huge military convoy. As it approached, the State Guard saluted. The lead car had a flag on it, as did several of the following cars. Generals, perhaps, Frank thought. Then the trucks, the flatbed trucks, carrying tanks, field guns, and truck after truck after truck of troop carriers. Frank and Lou had arrived at the precise moment the U.S. government was leaving Texas for the last time. The State Guard stood at attention for an hour as the convoy passed. Someone in the watching crowd along the highway started singing the Yellow Rose of Texas, and soon the song echoed through the river valley as 100 teary voices joined in. Frank hugged Lou, and the two stifled tears in between their laughter. Frank and Lou both thought about the implications of thousands of U.S. soldiers being replaced and relieved of duty by these scant 100 Texas troops. It was as if the age of military occupation of Texas, a leftover from the Civil War, had finally ended. Frank tried to sing along with the old version of the Yellow Rose of Texas. You may talk about your Beauregard or sing of General Lee, but the gallant hood of Texas. But his voice trailed off in tears. Frank could not think of anything else to say after that except, "Oh, Lou," again and again, in between kisses, as they watched the thunder of the convoy slowly pass out of the future and into the pages of history.